He will not force Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out. It's an enormous thrill for me to be here because a few years ago I came here to look at the fossil fish of one of my main characters. And that seems like such an odd thing to do. And when I went back into the collection and Paul had pulled out the drawers of these fossil fish found by a woman named Elizabeth Philpott, who nobody had ever heard of, I had already written the book, but I was checking things and rejigging things. And there's something about touching the things that your real person, your real character has touched that is so incredibly satisfying. I think the only other time I can remember being so thrilled was when I wrote a novel about William Blake called Burning Bright a few years ago, and I was able to convince the British Library to let me come and look at a notebook of his. And they actually let me touch it without white gloves, because they said white gloves are actually worse than no gloves because they make your fingers very clumsy. And, ooh, that's very dark. You can still see me though, that's good, yes. Very moody. Frankly, the fossil fish of Elizabeth Philpott, who is completely unknown compared to William Blake, who is very well known, was every bit as exciting for me. And I think more so because she's so unknown. Her colleague and her friend, and the other main character of Remarkable Creatures, Mary Anning, is a little bit better known. And what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about how I got the idea for this book, a bit about the two women, and I'm going to intersperse that with readings from the book. There are 4 readings I'm going to do, 1 very short, 3 longer. And then I'm very happy to take questions. We'll make the lights go up so you can see each other, and you can laugh at me en route while I illustrate it with slides, because me and PowerPoint have a funny relationship. And I know when PowerPoint, when you hear that, you immediately think, oh no, your heart sinks, because you're thinking of all those lectures or talks that you've been to where somebody talks and they basically say exactly what's on the screen. And then if they don't, you want to stand up and say, what about that bullet point? You forgot it. I promise you there are no bullet points here, and there's hardly any words. It's mostly just images. I found that people love looking at the beach on Lyme Regis, by Lyme Regis, even though, how many of you have actually been to Lyme Regis? Yes, most people have. Whenever I've talked about this book in the States or in France or wherever, people don't know Lyme Regis, but I don't even need to describe it to you because you know it so well. But it's a place that's very close to my heart now, and I think that comes out in the book. It becomes a bit of a character itself. Now, how did I get the idea for this book? Well, I have a son who's now 12. When he was about 7, he was at the tail end of his dinosaur craze that all kids go through, and you can see it out there now. Well, it's closed now, but earlier the kids going crazy for those dinosaurs. And Jacob really loved dinosaurs, and there's a little dinosaur museum in Dorchester, in Dorset. We have a house near it. We go to Dorset all the time. And it was rainy, it was half term, and I said, why don't we go to the dinosaur museum? So we did. Little place. And as we were walking around, amidst all of the scale, the Tyrannosaurus Rex and all that, so the models and things, there was this corner, a display about a woman named Mary Anning. And it looked like this. Now, it didn't look like that with me sitting there reading the book to her, which was what the publicity people wanted me to do the day the book came out. So I had to pretend to read to the mannequin of Mary Anning. But if you ignore me for a minute, that was the display, and I had never heard of Mary Anning. And what I took away from the display was that, number one, she was a working class woman, lived in Lyme Regis all her life, had no formal education, and yet she discovered the first complete dinosaur specimens in the UK without any formal training. And she provided an amazing array of fossils for the middle-class male scientists to study at the time. And it raised loads of questions about the history of the world, how old the Earth is, what animals existed before us. And the other thing I took away when I was looking at this display was something that happened to Mary when she was, oh, no, this is when PowerPoint gets you wrong. No, this is what she looks like, an official portrait of her, painted after she died, but by somebody who knew her, so that's supposedly what she looked like. But I much prefer this sketch, which is done by a man named Henry de la Beach, who is a geologist and a friend of hers from the teenage years. He came to Lyme Regis when he was a teenager. And he drew this for her in the 1830s when she was still working on the beach, wearing a top hat. Apparently she wore a man's top hat to protect her head from the falling rocks. So it's the early 19th century version of a hat you'd wear on a construction site, hard hat, with her hammer, which I'm going to show you a picture of that hammer a little later on. And I think this is much more affectionate, although I can't exactly see what she looks like. It always makes me think when I see that of all of the layers and layers of wool and leather she had to wear and how cold she must have gotten and how damp. She discovered, I wanted to show you the two specimens. This is not the specimen she discovered because somehow the Natural History Museum managed to lose part of it. But this is an ichthyosaur, which is a marine reptile 200 million years old. And she later discovered this is the first complete specimen of a plesiosaur. She discovered this one in December of 1823. But what happened to her, what I took away from the Dinosaur Museum that day, I left the Dinosaur Museum thinking, I have to write a novel about this woman. I knew nothing about fossils, geology, paleontology. I'm not science trained. I had no idea when I was going into the museum that I was going to come out with an idea for a novel, but that's how it works, and that's when it works best, is when you're not looking, it happens. It just jumps on you. And the thing that really swayed me and made me think I have to write about this woman is what happened to her when she was 15 months old. Lightning has struck me all my life. Just once was it real. I shouldn't remember it, for I was little more than a baby. But I do remember. I was in a field where there were horses and riders performing tricks. Then a storm blew in, and a woman picked me up and brought me under a tree. As she held me tight, I looked up and saw the pattern of black leaves against a white sky. Then there was a noise, like all the trees falling down round me, and a bright, bright light, which was like looking at the sun. A buzz ran right through me. It was as if I touched a hot coal, and I could smell singed flesh and sense there was pain, yet it weren't painful. I felt like a stocking turned inside out. Others began pulling at me and calling, but I couldn't make a sound. I was carried somewhere. Then there was warmth all around, not a blanket, but wet. It was water, and I knew water. Our house was close to the sea. I could see it from our windows. Then I opened my eyes, and it feels like they haven't been shut since. The lightning killed the woman holding me, and two girls standing next to her, but I survived. They say I was a quiet, sickly child before the storm, but after it, I grew up lively and alert. I can't say if they're right, but the memory of the lightning still runs through me like a shiver. It marks powerful moments of my life. Seeing the first crocodile skull my brother found and finding its body myself, discovering my other monsters on the beach, meeting all those men. Other times, I'll feel the lightning strike and wonder why it's come. Sometimes I don't understand, but accept what the lightning tells me, for the lightning is me. It entered me when I was a baby and never left. I feel an echo of the lightning each time I find a fossil, a little jolt that says, yes, Mary Anning, you are different from all the rocks on the beach. That's why I'm a hunter, to feel that bolt of lightning and that difference every day. How can you not write a novel about a woman who's been struck by lightning and survived? Mary's family used the lightning almost as a metaphor, and I picked that up from the display at the museum. It said that they said that she had been very sickly, lethargic, and she grew up intelligent, implying that the lightning somehow put something in her that made her different from other people and able to find things on the beach that other people couldn't find. And I thought it was a wonderful metaphor for genius. So I began doing research about her. I found out she grew up and lived in Lyme Regis. This is how we know it now. We know the beach. And possibly, a lot of people best know it for the French lieutenant's woman. We've all walked out on that cob and done our best Meryl Streep, looking very romantic. But there's a whole other side to Lyme that's nothing to do with the tourists or the beach for swimming or walking out on the cob. And it's something geological. It's a very special place, geologically speaking. There is a seam of limestone that runs through England along there. And it's a from the Jurassic period, 200 million years old. And it spills out onto the beach up here, Scarborough. There's also Robin Hood's Bay, Whitby. You find lots of ammonites, lots of also other things from 200 million years ago, marine reptiles. And the other part is it spills out down here, Lyme Regis over to Swanage. It's a 95-mile coastline called the Jurassic Coast. It's a UN World Heritage Site now. And that part of Lyme Regis is where you find the shoreline like that. You'd never go swimming there, but loads of people go along there looking for fossils, just as Mary Anning did. Along there, you can see them all now, all having a good look, just as I did. Mary would find things like this: ammonites, belemnites. Ammonites, by the way, were called snake stones by people in the early 19th century. They thought that they didn't know what they were. They thought they might be snakes that were all coiled up and had their head cut off. And it was believed if you carried them in your pocket, you'd scare snakes away. And of course, there aren't many snakes in England, so it seemed to work. Belemnites, they didn't know what they were either, and they called them thunderbolts, because they believed that was what God threw down when there was lightning, and that makes all the noise. And apparently, if you carry them in your pocket, you wouldn't get struck by lightning either. So clearly, that was what Mary did wrong. You also find little things that look a little odd like that, and that they used to call a vertebrary, short for vertebra. So they clearly knew it was the spine of some animal. They didn't know what it was. And Mary Anning's father, who was a cabinet maker, Richard Anning, he used to go out looking on the beach for these sorts of fossils, ammonites, belemnites, vertebraries, and he would sell them to tourists as passing trade as a supplement to his somewhat meager income. He used to take, in front of his house, he had a workshop there for his cabinets, and he'd put a table out there manned by him or his wife or his kids, Mary and her brother Joseph, and he taught them how to find fossils themselves, which was very useful later on. In fact, he gave Mary a hammer that he supposedly made, although I got to hold that recently at the Lyme Regis Museum, and the curator there said she suspects it's actually the head of a spade rather than something that was made. But nonetheless, it is what Mary used to use to extract fossils. Richard Anning, when he was in 1810, he died of consumption, and he left the family in terrible debt. Mary and her brother used to continue to look for fossils on the beach and sell them to people. And in the winter of 1810, 1811, Joseph came back and said that he had discovered a skull. This is now in the Natural History Museum in London. They found it in 1810 or 1811, and 18 months later, in November of 1812, Mary discovered the body. They put it together. They thought at first it was a crocodile, although they rapidly realized there were a lot of anatomical differences. For one, the ichthyosaur has paddles, and which the crocodile, of course, wouldn't. And it also has this amazing eye, the eye bone there. Now, crocodiles, I was just looking at the crocodiles out in the Natural History Museum right there, and there are these huge sockets, sort of, but they tend to be on top of the head, and they don't have this amazing bony eye ring. So they quickly knew that there wasn't, they didn't know what it was. It was something. And I'm going to read to you a scene now from when they've just discovered it, and they have to work out what to do with it. And they decide to show it to a friend of theirs named Elizabeth Philpott. Elizabeth Philpott, at this point, Mary is 11 years old, and Elizabeth is 20 years older than her, so she's 31, recently moved several years before to Lyme Regis. Next morning, we took Miss Elizabeth to see the skull. It were one of those clear, cold days that makes all the rocks look crisp, though it didn't last long, the winter sun just skinning the horizon past Lyme Bay. Despite the cold, Miss Elizabeth needed no convincing, but come out straight away. She wanted to see that monster. When we reached the end of Church Cliffs, I almost gasped at how clear its peculiar outline was in the cliff face. Miss Elizabeth was silent. She took off her nice gloves and put on the work gloves with the tips cut off so that she could run her fingers along its long, pointy snout and its great jumble of teeth. At the end, where the jaws were hinged, she prized off a flake of stone. "Look," she said, "there's a slight upturn of its mouth where it seems to be smiling. Do you recall in the drawing I showed you of the crocodile in Georges Cuvier's book?" "Yes, Mum, but look at its eye." I used my hammer to tap carefully and reveal more of the ring of bones that overlapped, like giant fish scales, round an empty center where the eyeball must have been once. Miss Elizabeth stared. "Are you sure that is the eye?" She seemed disturbed by it. "Don't know what else it could be," Joe said. "That is not how the crocodile eye looked in Cuvier's drawing." "Maybe this one had a problem with its eye," I suggested, "like a disease. Or maybe the Frenchman drew it wrong." Only a girl like you would dare question the work of the world's finest zoological anatomist. I frowned. I didn't like this Cuvier. Thankfully, Miss Elizabeth didn't dwell on my stupidity, nor on the croc's eye. She was more concerned with practical matters. "How are you going to get this out of the cliff? It must be 4 feet long at least." "It'll take digging like we've never done before, won't it, Joe?" Joe shrugged. "But 4 feet of rock? Won't that be too heavy for you? What you need are men to help you, strong men." Miss Elizabeth thought for a moment. "What about the men building the walkway along the beach to the Cobb? They know how to cut rock, and they're strong. Perhaps they could do it for you." "Perhaps they could, Mom," I said, "but we haven't the money to pay them." "I will advance you the money, and you can pay me back when you've sold the specimen." "Oh, could you, Miss Elizabeth? We'd be ever so grateful, wouldn't we, Joe?" But Joe weren't listening. "Mary, Miss Philpott, step away from it," he hissed. "It's Captain Curie." I looked back. Clambering round the bend that hid Lyme from us was the only other fossil hunter who might consider trying to get at our croc. While most respected others' finds, Captain Curie didn't care who had spotted something first. Once, he took a giant ammonite Joe and me had been digging from the cliff on Monmouth Beach and laughed in our faces when we told him it was ours. "Shouldn't have left it then, should you?" he'd said. "It were me finished the digging, it's me as gets it." Captain Curie mustn't see the crocodile skull. If he did, we would have to guard it all the time. I stepped back from the skull, picked up a likely rock to open, and moved down towards the water's edge where there was a flat stone good for hammering on. Joe headed in the Charmouth direction, then stopped 50 feet away to scrabble among small chunks of fool's gold, looking for pyretized ammos. Golden serpents, we called them. Miss Philpott took several steps, then began studying the ground and knelt to pick up a stone. From under my bonnet rim, I watched as Captain Curie approached the croc in the cliff face, his spade over one shoulder. Now that I had exposed its eye more clearly, the skull seemed to be staring and grinning to attract attention. Captain Curie's eyes skimmed the cliff, and he paused right where we had been standing. Joe's feet on the stones went quiet, and I stopped hammering. Captain Curie bent over and picked up something. When he straightened, his face was just inches from the monster's eye. Then he held out a glove. "Miss Philpott, is this yours? It's too fine for Mary." "I expect it is mine, Mr. Locke," Miss Elizabeth answered. She never called him Captain Curie, but used his real name, the way she called Joe Joseph, and Amos Ammonites, and not snake stones, and Bellies Belemnites. She was formal like that. "Bring it here, please." He went over and handed it to her. I could breathe again now we were away from the croc. Found anything, he asked when she thanked him. Just a Gryphea, a devil's toenail to you. Let's see it. Captain Curie squatted next to her. Fossil hunting does that to people. It breaks down the rules. On the beach, a hostler can speak to a lady in a way you wouldn't dream of doing anywhere else. I hurried over to rescue her. What are you doing here, Captain Curie? Same as you, Mary, looking out for Curies to bring in a few pennies. Mind you, you need 'em more than I do now, don't you, the way your father left you fixed? Here. He tossed something to me. It was a golden serpent. This is what I think of your Curies, Captain Curie. I turned and threw it as hard as I could. Though the tide was out, I got it to land in the water. Hey now! Captain Curie glared at me. No one likes to have their Curies wasted like that. It's like throwing coins in the sea. What a nasty girl you become, he said. Must have been that lightning shook you up and made you that way. You're so mean, you'll grow up into a sour old spinster who no man will look at. I opened my mouth to respond, but Miss Elizabeth got there before me. It's time you moved on, Mr. Locke. Captain Curie's glittery eyes shifted from me to her. Next time, I won't bother to pick up your gloves, Mum, he sneered. By now, Joe had come back, so he said no more, but swung his spade onto his shoulder and carried on down the beach towards Charmouth, glancing back now and then. Mary, you were very rude to him, Miss Elizabeth said. I'm ashamed of you. He was ruder to me and to you. Nonetheless, you should show respect to your elders, else they will think the worse of you. Sorry, Miss Philpott. I didn't feel at all sorry. You two stay here until the tide comes in, Miss Elizabeth commanded, in sight of the creature, to make sure William Locke doesn't come back and discover it. I will go to the Cobb to see about engaging the men to dig out the crocodile tomorrow, if it is a crocodile. Though what else could it be? I shrugged. Her question made me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. It'd be one of God's creatures, of course, Joe said. Sometimes I wonder. Wonder what, Mum? Miss Elizabeth looked at me and Joe and seemed to come to her senses, like she just realized it was us she was with. She shook her head. Nothing. It's just an odd-looking crocodile. She glanced at the skull once more before she left. Now, Elizabeth Philpott became very important to me in this book, and I think in a way she's the character who represents us and the journey that we, the readers, take through these fossils and through this landscape. I first heard about her when I started researching Mary Anning's life, and every now and then there'd be a reference to Elizabeth Philpott saying that they were great friends. Elizabeth Philpott used to go fossil hunting with Mary almost every day on the beach. And I thought how very odd this was because, first of all, she's 20 years older, but secondly, and possibly more importantly, there was a massive class divide at that time because we're talking the early 19th century. It would be like one of Jane Austen's characters becoming a friend to one of the servants. It just doesn't happen. It didn't happen then. And yet it did. And so I began looking into to Elizabeth's life and found out we know nothing about her. We have no idea what she looked like. All we know is that she was from a London family. Her father was a solicitor. There were 5 children. The parents died, 1 brother and 1 sister married, and the other 3 sisters came down to Lyme Regis in 1805, quite possibly because it was cheaper for unmarried women to live there than to live in London. And clearly the family must not have had enough money to support marrying the other 3 sisters because none of the 3 of them ever got married. They lived on Silver Street, the top of the town, in this house right there, which is now a hotel. Elizabeth liked to collect fossil fish. And this fish, in fact, you can see the real one out in the display that the museum has done of Mary and Elizabeth's remarkable creatures. When you go out the door, it's just along the corridor and on the left. This was one of the fossil fish I came to see in the collection in the back of the museum when I was doing my research because I absolutely loved them. At first you think they're so almost ugly, and yet there's something incredibly beautiful about them. And her collection became very well known in Lyme Regis. She had cabinets built, placed all over the house, and people came to look at her fish collection, including a Swiss scientist named Louis Agassiz in the 1830s. And he was extremely complimentary of both Elizabeth and Mary's fossil collections and the things they found, and also all of their knowledge. And this is what really appealed to me about telling both Mary's story and Elizabeth's story, is how little credit they got. The usual story, I'm sorry to say, until recently, of a woman working behind the scenes in what was essentially, and the publicity of it, the public's face was always male. At that point in England, women were not allowed to go to university. And if you wanted to become a scientist, if you wanted to study science at Oxford or Cambridge, you had to be a man. You could also, a woman couldn't join a scientific society like the Linnaean Society or the Geological Society. They could not write papers, they could not go to lectures, they couldn't go to the society meetings. And so they were excluded from all of the formal structures that would have allowed them to learn. And yet both women learned an enormous amount and were extremely helpful to the scientists who later went on to have specimens named after them. So Elizabeth's fossil fish were very important to her and became important to me. We know so little about her that for me, she was the perfect character. Mary, we know more about, and also Mary was very poor and spent most of her time on the beach looking for fossils. Elizabeth probably had a little bit of private income, found the fossils, went fossil hunting for pleasure. And she had the leisure and also the education to begin to ask some of the difficult questions that finding specimens like ichthyosaur, plesiosaur would have raised. At that time, the beginning of the 19th century, this is pre-Darwin by 40 years, most people were what we would now call creationists. Christians at that time believed that the world was very young, 6,000 years old, and there was no concept of the idea of extinction. The belief was that God created the world and then set it running, and it really remained as it is for 6,000 years. And to find something like an ichthyosaur that clearly no longer exists now just didn't make any sense to Christian beliefs at the time. But it's not a sort of question that Mary would ask, but it is something that Elizabeth might have asked. I'm going to read a scene now which shows you just how useful a character she is, because as a reader, as a 21st century reader, you want to be able to understand, get inside the idea, get inside a 19th century mindset. And this is what Elizabeth allows us to do. This is a scene that takes place very soon after the skull, the ichthyosaur skull, was extracted from the cliff. After encountering the skull the Annings had uncovered, I found it difficult to sleep, dreaming of the eyes of animals I had looked into, horses, cats, seagulls. There was a flatness in them, the lack of a God-given spark that frightened me into wakefulness. On Sunday, I remained behind after the service at St. Michael's, waving on my sisters. I will catch you up, I said, and stood at the back of the church, waiting for the vicar to finish his goodbyes to the other parishioners. Reverend Jones was a plain man, with a boxy head and thin lips twisting and turning even when every other part of him was still. I had not spoken to him except to mouth pleasantries, for he was uninspiring during services, his voice reedy, his sermons lackluster. However, he was a man of God, and I hoped he might be able to give me some guidance. At last, only a girl remained behind, sweeping the floor. Reverend Jones was going up and down the pews, picking up hymn sheets and checking for gloves or prayer books left behind. He did not see me. Indeed, his pastoral duties over for the day. He was doubtless thinking about the dinner he would soon sit down to and the sleep by the fire afterwards. When I cleared my throat and he looked up, he could not stop his mouth tightening into a brief grimace. Miss Philpott, is this handkerchief yours? He held out a ball of white cloth, probably hopeful that I could be easily dismissed. I'm afraid not, Reverend Jones. Ah, you are looking for something else, perhaps. A purse, a button, a hairpin. No, I wish to discuss a matter with you. I see. My dinner will be ready soon, and I need to finish up here. You don't mind? He continued along the pews, straightening cushions as I trailed behind. All the while, I could hear the scratch of the girl's broom on the floor. I wanted to ask you what you thought of fossils. In trying to hold his attention, my voice came out louder than I had intended in the empty church. What do I think of fossils, Miss Philpott? I do not think of them. But you do know what they are. They are skeletons that have been compressed by rock over time to become stone themselves. Most educated people know that. But the skeletons, are they of creatures that still exist today? Of course they exist. All of the creatures God made exist. I'm afraid I don't understand your question, Miss Philpott. I opened my purse and poured into my palm a few bits of fossils that had found their way there. Most of my pockets and purses held fossil pieces. Reverend Jones's mouth twisted in disgust as he glanced at the contents. Ammonites, belemnite shafts, a chunk of fossilized wood, a length of crinoid stem. He reacted as if I'd trailed horse dung into the church on my shoes. Why on earth are you carrying those about? I held out an ammonite. I should like to know where the live versions are of these, Reverend Jones, for I have never seen one. As we gazed at the fossil, I felt for a moment that I was being sucked into its spiral, farther and farther back in time, until the past was lost in the center. Reverend Jones's response to the ammonite was more prosaic. Perhaps you haven't seen them because they live out at sea, and their bodies only wash up after they die. He turned away, and pulling the door shut, locked it with a deft turn of a key, a gesture he seemed to enjoy. I stepped in front of him, so that he could not hurry off to his dinner. Indeed, he could not move at all, but was pinned in the corner. Have you heard about the crocodile head the Annings found in the cliffs and are showing at the assembly rooms? I said. I know of it, yes. Have you seen it? I have no desire to see it. I was not surprised. Reverend Jones showed no curiosity about anything other than what would soon be on his plate. The specimen does not look like any creature that lives now, I said. Someone, a member of this congregation, in fact, has suggested that it's an animal that God rejected in favor of a better design. Who said that? It's not important who said it. I just wondered if there was any truth in the theory. Miss Philpott, I am surprised. I thought you and your sisters were well versed in the Bible. We are. Let me make it clear. You need only to look to Scripture for answers to your questions. Come. He led the way back to the pulpit where the Bible he had read from lay. As he began flipping through the pages, the girl approached. Reverend Jones, sir, I've done the sweeping. Thank you, Fanny. Reverend Jones regarded her for a moment, then said, There's something else I would like you to do for me, child. Come over to the Bible. I want you to read out something to Miss Philpott. There's another penny in it for you. He turned to me. Fanny Miller and her family joined St. Michael's a few years ago from the Congregationalists, for they were deeply disturbed by the Annings fossil hunting. The Church of England is clearer in its biblical interpretation than some of the dissenters' churches. You've found much comfort here, haven't you, Fanny? Fanny nodded. She had wide crystal blue eyes, topped with dark eyebrows that contrasted with her fair hair. She would never lead with her eyes, though they were her best feature, but with her brow, which was wrinkled with apprehension as she gazed at the Bible. Don't be frightened, Fanny, Reverend Jones said to soothe her. You are a very good reader. I have heard you at Sunday school. Start here. He laid a finger on a passage. She read in a halting whisper. And God said, Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas. And the evening and the morning were the fifth day. Excellent, Fanny. You may stop there. I thought he had finished patronizing me by having an ignorant girl read out from Genesis, but Reverend Jones himself continued, "And God said, 'Let the earth bring forth a living creature after his kind.'" I stopped listening after a few lines. I knew them anyway and couldn't bear his oboe voice, which lacked the depth one expected of a man in his position. While he read, I let my eye rest on the page. To the left of the biblical words were annotations in red of Bishop Ussher's chronological calculations of the Bible. According to him, God created heaven and earth on the night preceding the 23rd of October, 4004 BC. I'd always wondered at his precision. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day. You see, Miss Philpott, it really is very simple. All you see about you is as God set it out at the beginning. He did not create beasts and then get rid of them. That would suggest he had made a mistake. And of course, as God is all-knowing and incapable of error, is he not? I suppose not. You suppose not? Of course not, I said. I'm sorry, it's just that I am confused. You are saying that everything we see around us is exactly as God created it, are you not? The mountains and seas and rocks and hills, the landscape is as it was at the beginning. Of course. Reverend Jones looked around at his church, tidy and quiet. We are done here, aren't we, Fanny? Yes, Reverend Jones. But I was not done. So every rock we see is as God created it at the beginning, I persisted, and the rocks came first, as it says in Genesis, before the animals. Yes, yes, Reverend Jones was becoming impatient, his mouth chewing on an imaginary straw. If that is the case, then how did the skeletons of animals get inside rocks and become fossils? If the rocks were already created by God before the animals, how is it that there are bodies in the rocks? Reverend Jones stared at me. His mouth at last stilled into a tight, straight line. Fanny Miller's forehead was a field of furrows. God placed the fossils there when he created the rocks. To test our faith, he responded at last, as he is clearly testing yours, Miss Philpott. It is my faith in you that is being tested, I thought. We've all heard those arguments before, I think, and amazingly, they are still going on. But you must put it in context. This was before Darwin. This happened, that scene took place in 1811, and Darwin's Origin of Species came out in 1859. So it's very, in a way, this book is an exploration of what people's ideas about the history of the world were before Darwin. And, but it's not just about fossils, it's also about a friendship between two women, very strong friendship, that sees them through a lot of difficulties. And I want to end now with a few slides just to show you the sort of research that I do when I'm writing books like this, and then I'll read one last scene. In order to do the books I do a lot of research, and some of it is what I call on-the-job training, or getting your hands dirty, in this case. It's gone off. No, it's on again. When I wrote Girl with a Pearl Earring, I took a class in painting, and when I wrote The Lady and the Unicorn, which is about medieval tapestries, I went to a tapestry studio and interviewed them and felt the cloth and wove a little bit. For Remarkable Creatures, I knew I should go out on the beaches and fossil hunt myself, because there's no way you can write about it without doing it. And luckily, I absolutely fell in love with it, and I still look for fossils on these beaches, even now, long after the book is out. And in order to do it, it really helps to have somebody show you what it is you're looking for. I got to know a man named Paddy Howe, who is the geologist at the Lyme Regis Museum, and now has his own fossil workshop. And he took me out a few times, and once, on a very cold February, he called me and said, we've discovered, sorry, a little bit of a, okay. He said, we've discovered what we think is an ichthyosaur jaw, because they're still finding ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs here. And he said, but it's out on when the tide is out, only twice a month is the tide low, far enough out that it uncovers it. It's in a ledge. So you have to come tomorrow. And I said, okay, so we all went along, my husband and son and I. And it was an incredibly bleak day, this was that day. And Patty said, we looked around and said, where is it? And he said, oh, it's right there. And I thought, how can you possibly see that? And it turns out that is the tooth of an ichthyosaur, these two. And it made me think, and he said he had passed this place many times and never seen it. And it made me realize just what an incredibly trained eye you have to have for someone like him and Mary Anning to find, because he found this right near where she found plenty of ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. And that's the sort of thing you have to look for, and you have to get, and what amazed me even more is the thought, Patty knows what an ichthyosaur looks like, and he knows that it exists. Mary didn't even know it existed, and yet she found it anyway. It was quite amazing. So he began chopping away around it. As you can see, it's extremely muddy, cold. It made me very, very grateful for my Gore-Tex, my fleece, my Wellingtons. He showed me how to do some chopping, and eventually we got out bits, and your hands get incredibly muddy. You get all that blue ice clay all over them. It leaches out. Your hands are wet when they're out there, and then they're really dry and wrinkled afterwards, and you get it under your nails almost permanently, and you get lots and lots of little cuts from various things. It's, your hands get ruined, really. Finally, we got it out. They later got other bits out and stretchered them back as if it's a little patient, but it's incredibly heavy. Even just a little piece like that was heavy, so they took things back. And later, it's not done just when you've cut it out. You then have to mount, you have to clean it and mount it, and that takes months. So months later, Patty had done that and showed it to me. And he has tons of stuff all over the place. So this is the beach just around the corner from where he found that. And I want to read one last scene, which has a very strong Oxford connection. The first professor of geology at Oxford was a man named William Buckland, who was one of the true English eccentrics. One of the things he wanted to do, apart from anything else in his life, he wanted to eat his way through the animal kingdom. So he ate all kinds of things. And he also was trained as a theologian. He was constantly trying to balance religion and science. There are theories that drove him mad at the end because he ended up in an asylum, but he was a fantastic lecturer at Oxford, very popular with students and other scientists. And he was from Axminster, which is not far from Lyme Regis. And he used to come down to the beaches, and Mary would help him out. Mary Anning helped him find things. She found things for him. He helped her to sell specimens later on. And I'm going to read a scene from when Mary is about 14 or 15, I think. And William Buckland has come down for the summer, and they go out on the beach together, but they have to have a chaperone because at that time you couldn't just be a woman on your own with a man. So I'm afraid Fanny Miller, the girl who was sweeping, comes into this. My trade is best done in bad weather. Rain flushes fossils out of the cliffs, and storms scrub the ledges clean of seaweed and sand so more can be seen. I never minded the cold or the wet, as long as I was finding curies. Mr. Buckland also wanted to go out, even when it was raining. Fanny Miller had to come with us, and would huddle wretched in her shawl, curled up amongst the boulders to shelter against the wind. We were often the only folk upon beach then, for in poor weather, visitors preferred to go to the bathhouses, which had heated water, or to play cards and read the papers at the assembly rooms, or to drink at the Three Cups. Only serious hunters went out in the rain. One rainy day towards the end of the summer, I was upon beach with Mr. Buckland and Fanny. There was no one else along that stretch of shore, though Captain Curie passed by at one point, nosing about to see what we were doing. Mr. Buckland had discovered a ridge of bumps not far from where we dug out the jaw in Church Cliffs and thought they might be a row of vertebrates from the same animal. I was chiseling away at it to try and uncover the bones when Mr. Buckland left my side. After a minute, Fanny come to stand close by, and I knew Mr. Buckland must be pissing in the water. He was always careful not to embarrass me and slipped off to do his business far enough away that I didn't have to see. I was used to him doing that, but it bothered Fanny, and it were the one time she'd come up to the cliff by me. Even after several weeks in his company, she was still a little scared of Mr. Buckland. I felt sorry for her. The rain was coming down hard and dripping on her face from her bonnet rim. It was too wet for her to sew or knit, and there's nothing worse than having nothing to do in the rain. "Why don't you just turn away when he's down there?" I said, trying to be helpful. "He's not going to wave it in your face. He's too much of a gentleman for that." Fanny shrugged. "You ever seen one?" she said after a moment. I think it was the first question she'd asked me in 10 years. "Just my brothers," I said, "when I were little. You?" I didn't think she would answer, but then she said, "Once at the Three Cups, a man got so drunk he dropped his trousers in the kitchen, thinking it were the privy." We both laughed. For a second, I wondered if we might be starting to get on better. We'd no chance for that. There were no warning, no pebbles raining down or the groan of stone splitting from stone. It were that sudden that one moment Fanny and I were laughing about men's parts by the cliff, and the next, the cliff just dropped, and I was knocked down and buried in the thick rocky clay. Though I don't remember doing it, I'd thrown up my hand up to my mouth as the cliff come down on me, and that made a little space for me to breathe in. I couldn't think anything, I couldn't see anything, and though I struggled, I couldn't move at all, for the clay was cold and wet and heavy, and it held me fast. I couldn't even call out. All I could do was think that I was going to die and wonder what God would say to me when he met me. There was a long, long time when nothing happened. Then I heard a scrabbling and felt hands clawing at me and wiping my eyes, and I opened them and saw Mr. Buckland's terrified face, and I thought maybe I would not meet God yet. "Oh, Mary," he cried. "Sir, get me out, sir." Mr. Buckland pulled at the rocks and mud, but couldn't move them. "It's too heavy, Mary. I can't get you out with no tools." He was in a kind of daze, as if he couldn't think straight. We heard a cry then. We'd forgot about Fanny. She was just a few feet from us and weren't so heavily buried as me, but there was blood on her face. She began to scream, and Mr. Buckland jumped up and went to her. The clay was loose around her, and he managed to shift it enough that he could pull her out. He wiped the blood from her face, and in doing so, knocked the bonnet from her head, for he was scared and clumsy. It got caught up in a gust of wind and rolled away down the beach. Losing her bonnet seemed to upset Fanny more than anything else. "My bonnet," she cried. "I need my bonnet. Ma'am will kill me if I lose it." Then she screamed again as Mr. Buckland tried to move her. "Her leg is broken," he said. "I'm going to have to leave you to get help." At that moment, part of the cliff farther along crumbled and crashed to the ground. Fanny screamed again. "Don't leave me, sir. Please don't leave me." I didn't want to be left either, but I did not cry out. "Best to carry her, sir, if you can. At least you can save one of us." Mr. Buckland looked horrified. "Oh, I don't think I should do that. It wouldn't be proper." It seemed even he, who ate field mice and carried a bright blue sack and pissed in the sea, was uneasy about holding a girl in his arms. "Put an arm around her shoulders and one under her knees and lift, sir," I said. "She's a little thing. You should be able to carry her, even a scholar like you." Mr. Buckland did what I said and heaved Fanny into his arms. She screamed again in pain and shame. Letting her arms flop wide, she turned her head away from him. "For God's sake, Fanny, put your arms around him," I cried. "Help the man or he'll never get you back." Fanny threw her arms around his neck and buried her face against his chest. "Take her to the bathhouse, that's the closest place, and send people straight back with spades." I wouldn't normally direct a gentleman so, but Mr. Buckland seemed to have lost his wits. "Hurry, please, sir. I can't bear being alone like this." As he nodded, another section of cliff fell away with a crash. Mr. Buckland flinched. I fastened my eyes on his. "Sir, pray for me. And if I die, tell Ma'am and Joe—" Don't say such a thing, Mary. I'll be back shortly." Mr. Buckland staggered away, Fanny gazing at me with glazed eyes over his shoulder. Later, Dr. Carpenter would set her leg, but the break was awkward and never healed properly, and left her with one leg shorter than the other. She could never walk far or stand for long, and could never again come out upon beach. Not that she would want to. Whenever I saw her hobbling down Broad Street to the Three Cups, I ducked my head to avoid that fearful blue gaze. Of course, I didn't know any of that then, held fast in a landslip. I watched Mr. Buckland weaving down the beach with his burden and wondered why it was that the pretty ones were always rescued before the plain. That was how the world worked. With her big eyes and dainty features, Fanny did not get stuck, whereas I was caught in the mud, the cliff threatening to crumble on top of me. I closed my eyes and said a long prayer for God to spare me, to let me live on to help Mam and Joe, to find more crocs, even to have a husband and children one day. And please God, make Mr. Buckland a runner rather than a walker today. Make him find someone quick and come back. It was quiet now. The wind had died down, and a fine, misty rain sprayed my face. Now and then I heard the faint skitter of more debris tumbling down the cliff to the ground. The mud that held me was cold and heavy and pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I closed my eyes for a bit, thinking that sleep might make the time go faster. But I couldn't sleep. I opened my eyes. Mr. Buckland was a dot along Church Cliffs. I couldn't believe he hadn't got farther. But then it was hard to say how much time had passed. It could have been 10 minutes or hours. I looked the other way, down the beach towards Charmouth. There were no boats out or fishermen checking crab pots, for it was too rough. There was no one at all, and the tide had turned and was slowly creeping up. I gave up looking for help and begun to notice things closer to me. The landslip had caused a churning up of rock, caught in an ooze of blue-gray clay. My eyes flicked over the stones near to me and come to rest on a familiar shape 4 feet from me, a ring of overlapping bony scales the size of my fist, a crocodile's eye. It was like it was staring straight at me. I cried out with the surprise of seeing it. Then, several feet past the eye, there was a movement. It was only tiny, but I cried out again, and it moved again. It was just a little pink spot sticking out of the clay, and with the rain in my eyes, it was hard to see what it was. I wondered if it were a crab scrabbling about in the mud. "Hey," I called, and it moved. It was not a crab, but a finger. I was so relieved and sick at the same time, I think I fainted. When I come to, I looked at the spot again, and it wasn't moving. "Who's that?" I said. "Who's that?" The finger moved. I was so happy not to be alone that I laughed aloud. "Joe? Is it Joe?" The finger didn't move. "Ma'am? Miss Philpott?" No movement. I knew it couldn't have been any of them, for I would have known if they were upon beach. But who else would be out in such weather? I suppose it could have been one of the children from Lyme, come to spy on me and Mr. Buckland, hoping to see something scandalous they could report back on. But it seemed unlikely. We would have spotted them if they were upon beach, unless they'd been up on the cliff, which meant they'd come down with the slip. It was thinking of the cliff and the landslips that made me realize who it must be. Captain Curie? I remember now, I'd seen him earlier. Even as the finger wriggled, I saw the handle of his spade poking out of the clay that had buried him. I was so glad he was there that any spite I felt towards him vanished. "Captain Curie, Mr. Buckland's gone to get help. Then they'll be back to dig us out." The finger moved, but less than before. "Was you up on the cliff and come down with a slip?" The finger didn't move. "Captain Curie, can you hear me? Are your bones broke? Fanny's leg is broke, I think. Mr. Buckland's taken her with him. He'll be back soon." I was chattering on to mask my terror. The finger stayed stiff, pointing up at the sky. I knew what that meant and begun to cry. Between me and Captain Curie, the croc eye watched us both. Captain Curie and I are going to be like the croc, I thought. We will become fossils, trapped upon beach forever. After a while, I stopped looking at Captain Curie's finger, now as still as any rock caught in the clay. I couldn't bear to watch the tide steadily rising. Instead, I gazed up into the flat white sky, a few pewter clouds swimming about in it. After spending so much of my life looking at stones, it was strange to look up into emptiness. I spotted a gull circling high above. It seemed it would never get closer, but would always be a dot hovering far away. I kept my eyes fixed on it and did not look at the finger or the croc eye again. It was so quiet, I wanted to make a noise to break the spell. I wanted the lightning to pass through me and jolt me back into life, for I was feeling the opposite of that sensation. A slow darkness was creeping through my body. There had been plenty of death in our family, Pa and all the children. I had spent most of my time collecting what were dead bodies of animals, but I had not thought much of my own death before. Now I was finding that dying was cold and hard and painful and dull. It went on too long. I was exhausted and growing bored with it. I had too much time to think about whether I was going to die from the tide coming in and drowning me, or the mud pressing the air out of me as it had Captain Curie, or a falling rock striking me. I couldn't think for long, or it hurt too much, like touching a piece of ice. It was hard to breathe now with the mud so heavy. My breathing got slower, and so did the beat of my heart, and I closed my eyes. When I come to, someone was digging at the clay around me. I opened my eyes and smiled. Thank you. I knew you would come. Oh, thank you for coming to me. And if you want to find out who saves her, you're going to have to read it. Thank you.